Welcome to another episode of Unraveled, where we break down the world's most pressing geopolitical developments with the experts who shape our understanding of them. Our focus today is the shifting global order with insights I have extracted from three latest articles published by Geopolitical Features in February and March 2025. These articles, number one, the US geostrategy and the World Order, published on February 20. Reaction in the Russian Periphery, published in February 27. And the constraints shaping US conflict resolution. It was published on March 6. These three articles offer a bold assessment of how Washington, D.C. is reshaping its foreign policy. How is it moving away from direct global security leadership and urging allies to take more responsibility in their own regions? The article argue that this transition, while complex, is timely given Russia's military struggles and China's internal economic challenges. Then the writer goes on to examine how this shift is compelling key players, that is Poland, Turkey, Azerbaijan, the middle powers, to rethink their strategic positions as they navigate a rapidly changing world order. In Europe, Poland is breaking down from the broader EU stance by strengthening its partnership with the US, doubting the viability of a European led defense framework. In the Middle East and the Caucasus, Turkey has used Russia's setbacks to expand its regional influence, but could its ambitions be limited by a revived Moscow? And Azerbaijan, a rising middle power, is recalibrating its ties with Russia, possibly seeking deeper alignment with Washington. These arguments spark crucial debate. Can the US truly step back without destabilizing global security? Is Russia's decline permanent, or is it temporary? Can Europe and middle powers like Turkey and Azerbaijan adapt to this shifting landscape without unintended consequences? These are the questions we must examine closely. To break it down, we are joined by the author himself, Dr. Kamran Bokhari, a leading expert on geopolitics and international security. Dr. Bukhari, welcome back to Unraveled.
Thank you, Marvi. It's always wonderful to be with you.
Thank you. So before we get deep into your arguments, Dr. Bukhari, let me start with what is hot right now. And I have had public demand to ask you these two questions to start with very briefly. Will President Trump impose new travel restrictions on Pakistanis, and what factors might influence the decision?
Thank you, Marvi. So before I say anything, I just want to point out so that there is no misunderstanding. As an analyst, I explain, I don't justify. And so explanation is not justification. So if it comes across that I'm somehow, in support of something, I have my views and I try not to bring them into my analysis. I have my preferences like everybody else. But I firmly believe, religiously believe, that it's the job of the analyst to not be swayed by their subjective preferences and try to keep their bias to as minimum as possible, as humanly as possible. So with that, let me answer your question. I have not seen a whole lot of detail on what these travel restrictions will look like. We have a bit more detail on the restrictions on people coming from Afghanistan. But we don't have too many details on the restrictions that could be imposed on Pakistan. And then there are other nations as well. My understanding is that as of right now, when we are recording, the Trump administration has not finalized these plans. They have, as I read the media, they are things that are potentially in the works, but it's not really clear. Now, in the business of analysis, we speculate. At least
Yeah.
that's where we begin our analysis. That's sort
Mm,
of the first step. So if I had to speculate, I don't think that it's going to be very easy for the Trump administration to sort of put restrictions on people traveling from Pakistan
mm,
unless the president has an ask of Pakistan that Pakistan is resisting. You have to understand that this president is quite transactional, if I can use that word, and he uses these threats or these moves, whether they're travel restrictions or they're tariffs,
mm,
uh, or anything like that, an instrument like that, to gain leverage and in order to steer the other party towards a
mm,
negotiation. So, and in some cases, with a travel restriction, it could be that, there are genuine security concerns. So that may also be driving this move. Again, it's in the making, it's not done yet. So
mm,
if we look at the context, the president mentioned Pakistan in his speech to the joint sitting of Congress the other night. And he actually thanked Pakistan for its cooperation in apprehending the alleged mastermind of the attack on U.S. forces when
mm,
they were withdrawing, in the middle of withdrawing from Afghanistan in August of 2021.
mm,
And there's been conversation between other senior officials and Pakistani leaders. So
mm,
it doesn't look like this is something that is a done deal. So
mm.
I would say let's hope for the best
Yeah.
and take it from there.
Absolutely. And the second hot take on the Trump administration's unfreezing of 397 million, apparently for Pakistan's F-16s, and also how President Trump publicly thanked Pakistan for its role in Sharifullah's arrest, the terrorist. Are we witnessing a genuine shift towards improved US-Pakistan relations?
No, I can't make that claim. I can't make that analysis just yet because this
Mm,
is just, a data point and a half.
yeah.
And we don't have much to go by. I think, again, this was a tactical thing that happened.
Hmm.
Um, as I understand it, uh, I think the US intelligence community basically had the intelligence on the whereabouts of this person, and they shared it with the Pakistanis, asked them to apprehend the person and hand him over. And I think the Pakistanis came in and complied. Now,
Mm,
um, does that is that something that you can build upon if you're Islamabad? Sure. There are always ways to build upon, but
mm,
the way to do this for Pakistan is to somehow position itself
mm,
in the imperatives of the US. What is it that the US needs at this time? So
mm,
the idea that, we're going to become a big counterterrorism partner, and then that will revive Pakistani-US relations. I think that time has come and gone.
mm,
Those days are long gone. Counterterrorism isn't the kind of threat or the kind of, if you will, challenge for the United States that it used to be in years and decades past. We're well beyond that time period. Right
mm,
now, the world has changed. And in this changing world, the US is shifting. So the question for the Pakistani leadership is, where can they position themselves in this shifting US foreign policy outlook? How can they help? And then, in exchange for cooperation on those issues that matter most to the US, what
mm,
can Pakistan do? And then I think that's where the conversation begins, or that's sort of the anchor of the conversation that is supposed to happen. So I think this is the Pakistanis need to sort of throw out the old paradigm and get
mm,
creative and say, hey, this is a new world. Uh,
mm,
America is trying to find its new bearing, and where do we
mm,
fit into this? And I guess it requires a bit of deep thinking and strategic planning.
mm. That's right. So now, coming to your arguments in this series of three very interesting recent articles. Your analysis suggests, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the US is fundamentally restructuring its global role. But is this a well-calculated shift, or is Washington improvising in response to short-term pressures?
So I think it's a bit of both. Reality is somewhere between those two, if you will, propositions that you laid out.
Mhm.
Um, on one hand, the world has already shifted, regardless of what President Trump is trying to do. President
Mm.
Trump is responding to realities that have changed
Yeah.
because there are pressures that he feels from his electorate, and what he tries to do are
Mm.
responses to those public demands. So
Mm.
the appetite within the American public, which is clear from the fact that he
Mm.
won the presidential election, and not just the electoral college, but the popular vote, and
Mm.
he took all the swing states and actually
Yeah.
basically had a deep ingress into blue electoral districts in several parts of the country. So what does that mean? That means that people want the kind of change. They may not know what that change is going to look like. I think that the administration is still figuring that out. But there is a demand that the old ways of doing things are not
Mm.
working for the American people. So when the American people look at American outlays, financial outlays, they say, well, what about the home front? You know,
Mm.
why are we doing this overseas? Now, obviously, there are those within America who
Mm.
believe that there should be more continuity than change, that
Mm.
everything that the United States has been doing should not be just, sledgehammered, if you will.
Mm. Okay.
But the reality is that the world has shifted. It has been shifting. So what do I
Mm.
mean by that? What I mean by that is uh, the Soviet Union imploded over 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But the Cold War between Washington and Moscow was not put to rest. It did
Mm.
not end the Cold War. The Cold War continued. There was an interregnum of about a decade when Moscow was in chaos. After Moscow found its bearings, and that was around the time when President Putin took power, uh, that Cold War scenario was back. And in a sense that it never really went away. So now, if you fast forward to the war in Ukraine, you look at the results of the war in Ukraine. Uh,
Mm.
you get a sense that Russian Federation is not the military power that the Soviet Union used to be.
Mm.
Its dismal performance in the Ukrainian battle space has laid bare its weaknesses. So that's number one. So that's what is informing the US shift in its posture. That look,
Mm.
yes, Russia is a threat, but it's not the threat that we used to think. And we're still playing by the old rules of the game, NATO. And by the way, the questioning of NATO has been happening since the end of the Soviet Union, since late 1991, early 1992. Consistently, this has been part of the American debate on foreign policy. What is the role of NATO? What is the relevance of NATO? There was some relevance that emerged when Al Qaeda attacked on 9/11, and then NATO created that ISAF, the military
Mm.
force that was deployed in Afghanistan. But then quickly, within less than 2 years later, the United States created a coalition of the willing because NATO did not agree to go with the Bush administration at the time to effect regime change in Iraq. So this debate over what is NATO's future has been going on for a long time. And it takes a while for things to change. Ultimately, you get a president who says, okay, you know what, enough is enough. We need to shift. And what is the return on investment, especially for a president who is not your traditional politician, who's a businessman and who looks at things from a different angle. and is more transactional. So what he's saying is, you know, this isn't 1945. This isn't 1961 or 62 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is definitely not 1979 when the Soviets breached the containment line and intervened in Afghanistan. This is a new world where Russia is not the threat that it used to be. And if it is a threat, it might be a threat to Europe. But Europe isn't hapless. Europe does not need us to babysit it.
Mm,
And Europe is quite capable. And why does the US need to bear this burden? And why not shift it to allies, to regional stakeholders? It's not the US is disengaging. There's a lot of hyperbole in the media and and
mm,
and and in the analytical market, if I can say so, where people are saying, "Oh, the United States is abdicating." Well, it's not abdicating. It's basically shifting and saying, "Do we need to do this, or can this
mm,
be basically farmed out to regional stakeholders?" Again, this is not Trump's idea. This is something that started to develop in the final days of the Bush administration, second
mm,
term, and early years of the Obama administration, with the idea of no boots on the ground. Technology, drones, intelligence operations, special forces operations could allow to deal with security in a much more leaner way. You don't need the massive NATO structures and the infrastructure to be able to provide for security. The world is changing technologically and powers are shifting. So so here we are. Now we have a president who's saying, let's put those ideas into practice.
mm,
And change is unsettling, to say the least. It is terrifying to many,
mm,
and people will react.
mm,
And this isn't the first time that this is happening in the United States. You go back to the beginning of this era that is ending before our eyes,
mm,
and you see what former President FDR did in his 4 terms. He was also seen as doing the unthinkable, with the idea of Medicaid and Social Security and so on and so forth. At the time, the idea was that, oh my God, this is socialism that is being adopted in America. And it was the Republicans who were screaming at the Democrats for trying to do this.
mm,
But there comes a shift. Circumstances develop that are due to impersonal forces that then leadership have to, or they don't, respond to it.
mm. Yeah. But I'm also intrigued by something you said, your argument about your assessment about Russia, that its military failures in Ukraine and, other things that you indicated, they indicated long-term decline. However, we also know that Russia has rebounded from these past crises, including whether it was collapse of Soviet Union, the economic turmoil in the 1980s, sorry, 1990s, the military setbacks in Chechnya, Georgia, all of that. Are we underestimating Russia's ability to adapt, rebuild, and use asymmetric warfare, especially, particularly in cyber operations and energy leverages, to remain a disruptive force in global politics?
So that remains to be seen. And so that's a great question. I think that what the Trump administration is trying to do is to assess
Mm,
whether Russia is ready to stop being a militaristic force and
mm,
focus on its economy, which is in shambles.
mm,
And its long-term indicators show a long-term
mm,
decline. There are already labor shortages severe enough to
mm,
where the North Koreans are asked to come and fight against the Ukrainian forces or defend areas like Kursk, which are part of the Russian Federation. You have migrant laborers being sought from places like Myanmar, even Afghanistan. And I mean, these are reports out there. We don't know what is the exact precise situation, but what we can infer is that there are serious uh, issues that are structural. So
mm,
the question is, are those people in the Kremlin
mm,
uh, on the ascendancy who say, well, warfare has not brought us much. In
mm,
fact, we've become worse off, and perhaps it's a time to end this conflict
mm,
and become a prosperous nation. And it will take a long time. We have many decades of struggle ahead of us.
mm,
An indicator that that might be happening, one indicator is the fact that Putin only a few months ago appointed an economist as the defense minister. And so
mm,
there are these indications that there is a rethink. The question is one of Russian vulnerability. See, we like to view, or we're conditioned to see uh, military force from a lens of aggression, which is true, but it's not the full picture. Their
mm,
aggression is also propelled or driven by fears, threats. So from the Russian point of view, uh, the issue is uh, the West is on our doorstep. It's
mm,
increasingly pushing towards us,
mm,
and we have to defend ourselves.
mm,
So the question and the challenge before the Trump national security team is that can they reach an understanding with Russia that, look, we're not here to destabilize you. We're not here to threaten you.
mm,
We are not interested in, this NATO aggressively pushing eastwards and enveloping, which is sort of the doomsday scenario in the minds, or the nightmare scenario in the minds of Russian strategists. But in exchange, are you ready for a different kind of relationship?
mm,
Uh, we don't know. I don't think the Trump administration knows that. You won't know it until you try to negotiate. Remember, negotiations are held more so with adversaries than your friends. You obviously negotiate with your friends as well, but the nature of it is very different. You have very complicated relationships that need to be untangled. And
mm,
this is a process that has to go through. It may very well be that the Trump administration does not succeed in this,
mm,
and we don't reach an understanding, and which is why you, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, the president
mm,
himself, Vice President J.D. Vance, everyone who's spoken on this has basically, hedged and said, we don't know where this is going. Uh,
mm,
but we're trying to assess that. So I think that that needs to be kept in mind. We assume, because of partisan politics, because of there is this sort of default sort of posture among everybody, us included, that especially when it comes to assessing, evaluating people who we oppose,
mm,
ideologically or politically, that we think that they don't know what they're doing, that these are, amateurish foreign policy moves, or risky moves, and they're a threat to national security. And so we don't realize
mm,
that the politician
mm,
does not want to lose politically, and will not do something that will weaken their position. So I can't imagine the president doing something, any president,
mm,
deliberately, or out of, if you will, carelessness,
mm,
that would undermine their own power, their own position. In other words,
mm,
self-interest necessitates that political actors take great care in high-risk maneuvers. So I think that that's what's happening here. It remains to be seen whether Russia is ready for that.
mm,
And then it's not like the United States is basically saying, okay, uh, sure, we're no longer. So if Russia does not commit to an agreement,
mm,
it will be hard for the United States to sort of say, okay, Europe, you're on your own. The US will continue to have a role. What the US wants in either circumstance, whether we have an understanding, and that's ideal. I mean, we're
Mm,
looking at something akin to what the Nixon administration achieved with the People's Republic of China. Uh,
mm,
but if that doesn't happen, the United States still wants the Europeans, our allies,
mm,
to have a bigger burden sharing, at least equitable that was agreed upon. And
mm,
that's what's shifting. Will it be under NATO? We don't know. Will it be under a new architecture? Again, we don't know.
mm,
But the old ways of doing things are not no longer viable,
mm,
and a new system will take a long time to emerge. So we're in that funny space,
mm,
an interregnum, if you will. And I would say that we are not used to we're used to in America, leading the world. We look back at the Reagan era. That was a different era. And I mean, you can talk about any other presidency. You can talk about Jimmy
mm,
Carter before him. You can talk about the successors of Reagan, and including his vice president, President Clinton, and President Bush and
mm,
Obama. That was an age. That was a reality of a particular age. We are now in a different age,
mm,
for which the old rules of the game don't apply. If you look at how the Biden administration performed, uh, I mean, they were continuing to fund endlessly the war in Ukraine. We don't know, and the result was that eventually, as you said, the Russians regained their bearing and started to make progress on the battlefield. So now the question is, how long do you stay on that strategy
mm,
while Russia is gaining, even if it is piecemeal, more territory? And so,
mm,
and there's more bloodshed, and more death and destruction. Same thing
mm,
for, the Middle East. The
mm,
Biden administration was trying to use tools, and if you look at the years, and some months since October 7, 2023, when Hamas attacked Israel, and we had the outbreak of a horrific war in the region,
mm,
you see the Biden administration trying to deal with it in the old ways and not
mm,
being successful. So
mm.
I think that there's a need for a new approach. What that approach is not very clear, and it will take time to emerge.
Yeah, and we are, by having these debates, we are actually, I think we are trying to understand and we're trying to uh, see what that approach could be. But something that you said earlier, I mean, throughout your articles, I mean, and we have seen many other experts, and we can see that there is a changing world order. And as you said, a businessman president mm, is leading a transformation in the global order by shifting security responsibilities to allies. However, I mean, the historical attempts to disengage from global commitments, whether in Europe or in Middle East, they have often led to instability, and they have forced Washington to re-engage. So, given the entrenched security structures and the limits of regional actors' capabilities, including Europe, do you believe the US can truly step back from being the primary security guarantor, or is this transition bound to create dangerous power vacuums?
That is the risk. I mean, until you have sort of thrown away the old rule book, and the
Mm,
new rule book has not yet, emerged. So there
mm,
you're in that space of uncertainty, and that's where you have lots of vulnerabilities, and there are risks of further instability. That's part of the nature. But
mm,
if you look at what was happening, if you didn't do this, you still
mm,
had instability.
mm,
We now, the Middle East was at a point where Israel and Iran had engaged in the unthinkable, direct clashes.
mm,
And how beyond the pale is it to imagine that, the Iranians doing a nuclear test or being bombed before that? So the
mm,
situation is deteriorating. if you look at, where the Palestinian issue is, and if you look at this, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how it is radiating and creating instability in Egypt and in Jordan, creating a massive headache for Saudi
mm,
Arabia and the Gulf Arab states, especially UAE. You
mm,
see that. You see the Assad regime falling. Nobody
mm,
thought that Hezbollah could be neutered militarily in this way. So these
mm,
are all things that have happened. And so what I'm trying to say is that whether you stick with the old ways or you try to
mm,
do the new ways, a
mm,
new way of doing things,
mm,
in this case, foreign policy, you
mm,
still have instability. It's not like if President Trump said, okay, you know what, I'm going to desist from any risky moves, that the world was a better place. The world was not. It was deteriorating. We've already talked about Europe. The situation with
mm,
China, there's no solution for it. So I think the idea of uh, this notion, it's not very well developed, but this administration continues to repeat it and definitely believes in it. The idea of peace through strength, making deals, ending wars. These are not easy things. And we've already talked about how there's no, certainty that there's going to be success. Uh, I think it deserves a much better debate than is existing right now, which is
mm,
completely partisan.
mm,
And it's the conversations are refracted, and we find ourselves discussing, things that don't matter, and we're not really judging and evaluating policy. We're just sort of playing politics with politics. If
yeah.
and partisanship meets partisanship, and that's sort of the problem that is clouding clear thinking, which is why when I try to write and say something, I try to steer clear of the partisanship. And I say, look, these are things that require a serious conversation. And how can we have that? Do we have, answers for everything? No, that's what a conversation is about. That's what debate and national discussion, national debate is all about, to come up with solutions. Does the Trump administration know everything? No, they're trying different things and they backfire.
Mm,
Many of them backfire. Many of them have a risk of backfiring. Some of them will be successful. We just don't know. This is a process that you have to engage in.
yeah. Another thing that I mean, you highlighted Poland's pragmatic alignment with the US, and due to skepticism about Franco-German-led European defense framework. However, Europe has significantly increased its defense spending, and Germany, as we see, is even amending its constitution to expand its military investments. Is Poland, in your view, is Poland's stance truly an indicator of European reliance on the US, or are we witnessing the eager, the early stages of legitimate European defense architecture that could challenge the current NATO model?
So, look, for the longest time, successive American presidents, successive American administrations have, since the end of the Cold War, so the fall of the Soviet Union, let me
Mm,
correct myself, have relayed to
mm,
their European allies
mm,
that they need to take greater responsibility in the light of the changes, and that there will be a time
mm,
when this current arrangement will not be viable. The mood of the American public will shift, and as it has happened in history. I mean, we assume that the Cold War period,
mm,
from 45 to 91, that period, the bipolar era, with the Soviets on one side and the Americans on the other, was going to last forever.
mm,
And successive American presidents have told their European counterparts that you need to slowly begin to take up more responsibility, this will not continue. We're not pulling the plug just yet, but there will come a time when American priorities will shift. The Europeans haven't done that. And
mm,
they basically are now finding themselves in sort of a rude awakening. I mean, they shouldn't have this experience, but because they saw Trump won, then perhaps they thought that, hey, Trump 1.0 was sort of one of those flukes and statistical outliers, and that the United States will go back to its sort of, internationalist posture. And when
mm,
Biden came in, they probably thought that, hey, we don't need to do anything just yet.
mm,
Uh, and so now that they are facing the moment of truth, it is natural to see them to come up with different solutions. You have, as I mentioned in my piece, that Poland is doing one thing, the Brits are doing something similar. The French and the Germans are doing something similar. The rest of Europe is still trying to figure it out. And the ultimate problem is that Europe is not, or the European Union is not the same as the United States of America. The 50 states are not sovereign in the United States. The federal government is sovereign, and they are constituent parts of the American Union. In the case of the European Union, you have 27 sovereign states with their
mm,
own interests that have
mm,
not really gelled beyond a certain limited space. Economic prosperity, or the promise of economic prosperity, and shared, if you will, values, and shared history, and a shared future, visions of a shared future, led them to sort of say, okay, let's have a European Union.
mm,
But if you notice, back in the late 2010s and late 2000s and early 2010s, you had the Greek banking crisis, and that created a huge challenge for the Europeans on
mm,
how to deal with that, because ultimately the idea was that the German public is asking the German government, why are we paying for a bailout for Greece? Because it's not one country. These are two separate countries. They should be able to deal with their own problems. And that
mm,
created a conundrum between the,
mm,
and over the years, you've seen the growing rise of the far right
mm,
in Europe because
mm,
of these sentiments, and because of the failure of the UN, the EU.
mm,
Then you had Brexit. Who would have thought that the United Kingdom would leave the European Union? Everybody knew that they were not part of the Eurozone, but it
mm,
was not seen. I mean, there were people within Britain who were shocked that, a majority of people would say, yes, let's leave the European Union. And so, and then the French and the German competition, it has always been there. Germany is the reunification of Germany has created a new reality in the last 30 years, where Germany is the biggest economy of the continent. And so there are expectations, there are concerns about Germany. And so, can the Germans, with all these internal differences,
mm,
come together in an agreement on collective security? Collective security is a function of pooling resources. It is also, more importantly, it's a function of having a unified command. NATO worked because the US was driving it. The
yeah,
US, as the superpower of the world, was behind it. Can the Europeans have something similar with all these differences? There was something called shape, which was sort of the mechanism through which NATO operated, led by the United States. This architecture is very complex. Can there be an alternative architecture?
mm,
Yes, but the question is when, and at what cost, and what are the constraints on the Europeans? So
mm,
it's not going to be easy. So my view is that I think that when the dust settles, the United States will still be, uh, you know, involved insecurity, but it will not be involved as it has, and there'll be greater burden sharing on the part of the Europeans. And so we're now sort of between yearning for the past
mm,
or what has been so far and
mm,
the fear of the future. So
mm,
this is just the beginning of the conversation. We're in the early stages of this conversation. So it's
mm.
natural for people to, oscillate between these two positions. But I
Mm.
think at some point things will settle down if, you're asking for my analysis and forecast.
Yeah, but um, another point that I, related one, uh, comes I noticed in your articles, one article is the US-Russia engagement, that we have seen in the recent days and weeks is compelling countries like the Poland, Turkey, Azerbaijan to adjust their strategic alignments, so to say. But given Russia's history of using diplomacy as a tool for strategic deception, how realistic it is to expect a stable US-Russia accommodation, so to say.
At this stage, it's unclear at best. I mean, we don't know that there is going to be an accommodation. What we do know is that there are efforts towards an accommodation. When Nixon and Kissinger engaged with China and the Chinese leadership at the time, did they know where it was going? No. The part of the problem in terms of the public imagination is we are so used to sort of the end state that we cherish and we value because
Mm,
it was a success. We don't see the process. We're not conditioned to seeing the process, which is always messy. So we look back at the era of FDR, and it's packaged in a way, it's part of a narrative that we teach in educational institutions that are there in history books. And so it is seen as it is celebrated, and rightfully so. But if you were alive at that time, and the history does capture
mm,
the ruckus, if you will,
mm, mm,
while it was still being it was still in motion. The FDR's restructuring of the United States government to deal with the challenges of
mm,
the Great Depression and world wars in Europe and the global moment at the time. The history books do capture some of it, but if you were living through it,
mm,
then you would be part of those who would be doing exactly what many people are doing today.
mm,
So let's assume
mm,
for the moment, there are no
mm,
guarantees that just like the United States and China found accommodation, and the
mm,
People's Republic of China decided to split from the Soviet Union,
mm,
and the US and Chinese relationship flowered. Later on, it created its own set of problems that
mm,
happens over time. But let's say something similar happens between Washington and Moscow. Then, decades from now, people will be looking back and saying, oh, wow, that was, good for the United States, good for the world, assuming it works out. But for the moment, in the here and now, we aren't there. We are in a moment in time where there's absolute uncertainty,
mm,
and so we are rightfully frightened and we are critical. But I
mm,
think that we need to be mindful that we do not allow our partisan political perspectives to shape our critique. Critique needs to be constructive in
yeah.
order for it to be able to translate into policy. See, we have a
Mm,
hard time, and this isn't easy to disentangle the politics from policy.
yeah.
As analysts, as academics, as people who observe things,
Mm,
uh, we try to parse out the two. and disentangle, disaggregate. But in real time, it's very hard. I mean, for people who have genuine concerns or are driven by, deeply entrenched partisan political views. So I think that that remains to be seen. I don't know. I mean, it could all fall apart. This entire
Yeah.
effort
Yeah,
could fall
yeah.
apart, but I don't want to say it will fall apart because I have no evidence to say that it will necessarily fall apart. And likewise, I have no evidence to say that it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. I'm an analyst, not a politician.
Yeah, no, no, that's completely understandable. My only concern is that the way it is happening, the this engagement, so to say, don't you think it actually emboldens Moscow by allowing it to regroup while leaving key US allies in a vulnerable and uncertain position?
I would say that we are getting a very sort of controlled picture of what is happening in the media. The public isn't getting a whole lot. It's the nature of public relations. It's the nature of public statements by politicians and governments, especially when they're engaged in high risk maneuvers that they want to limit what
Mm,
happens because then it could all, then they can't control it. So limiting that information is part of the process. It's neither good nor bad. It is what it is. So, but I don't think the Russians are under any illusion that, from their perspective, that the United States is just sort of saying, let's cut a deal. They know it's bargaining. When you have bargaining, uh, if I had to sort of, again, speculate, analyze, I would say that the Americans are basically saying, look, this administration is telling the Putin government that, look, you have failed to take over Ukraine. You wanted to. 3 years ago, your entire military operation was geared towards conquering Ukraine. Everybody on our side thought you would do it. In fact, many of us were shocked that you couldn't do it. That
mm,
is your reality. You can't do that. Okay, so you have some areas you can't do that. Let's
mm,
cut a deal. We will say, okay, you don't have to, we will not threaten you with NATO, but you can't move forward. So let's come to a ceasefire. Let's come to a compromise. And
mm,
let's figure out where that line will be
mm,
finally drawn. I mean, people from Pakistan and India should realize they have a line of control in Kashmir.
mm.
Likewise, there's a line of actual control between China and India. So
Yeah.
these are realities of life. So the administration is saying to its Russian counterparts, let's get to that conversation. But for that, you need to be able to think differently. We are ready to think differently. We are
Mm,
willing to work. And I would guess that the Russians don't believe the Americans when they say that,
mm,
especially at this early stage of the conversation. And they're doubting every word and they're saying, are these guys for real? We can't trust them. I mean, we were told when the Soviet Union fell that there would be no, we wouldn't invade with NATO. NATO would not move to our
mm,
borders. But look what happened. So why should we trust these people?
mm,
And then the Americans are also saying, and this is something that Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said publicly, that there are three dimensions to what we're trying to achieve with Russia. One is this, restoration of diplomatic relations.
mm,
Second is an end to the fighting in Ukraine. And third is a broader resetting of Russian-American relations that
mm,
will have strategic implications, and we'd like to be able to cooperate in the geoeconomic sphere. So
mm,
they're looking at a broader relationship and they're sort of putting this on the table
mm,
for the Russians to consider and say, okay, come forward. So then the question is trust, confidence building. We talk about CBMs, confidence building measures. So then it requires gestures. So
mm,
forcing the Ukrainians to agree, come to the table, getting the Europeans to come out of this mentality of there's always going to be this conflict is
mm,
part of that process. That is the American gesture And it's not going to be very choreographed. It is not going to be it's going to be messy,
Hmm.
especially in this age when, we have social media and there's just so much connectivity in terms of technology and communications and whatnot, that you can't control these things. So things happen, and this is a human enterprise and a human endeavor that is bound to have, be messy, if I can use that term. So it's not going to be neat. It's not going to be one of those things, especially when you have a paradigm that is being thrown out and a new paradigm that is being adopted, or there's an effort to adopt a new paradigm. So the Americans are saying, okay, what can you give us in exchange? I mean, obviously, here, one American ask is that, look, we don't want to confront you. We have a challenge from China. And by the way, China isn't your ally either, despite what you may say to the world and despite what, the West may believe. The reality is your footprint in Central Asia is receding. You can't match Chinese financial prowess. And they're building BRI, they're developing these relations, they're pushing westwards in Eurasia. That's your region. We're
Hmm.
not there. So there is a common interest here for us to check
Hmm.
Chinese expansion, even if it is geoeconomic. And that
Hmm.
could potentially in the future translate into the military sphere. So, and
Hmm.
your history with China is as
Hmm.
such that, it's anybody who's read the history knows that you're not exactly friends. I
Yeah.
believe these are the kind of conversations, Marvi, that are happening. They're not happening in front of cameras for good reason. But these are the kind of conversations that have to happen. Will they lead to an understanding, a meeting of minds? That remains to be seen.
Yeah. So going to, moving towards the Middle East slightly, you also argue that Turkey has taken advantage of Russia's decline, if we can call it Russia's decline, to expand its influence in the Black Sea, the Caucasus, the Syria. However, Turkey faces economic crises of its own, its internal, political struggles, and its strained relations with key players like Saudi Arabia and Iran, all of which I think limits its ability to project a sustained power. So, is Turkey's geopolitical assertiveness um, a sustainable long-term strategy, or do you think does Ankara risk uh, overextending itself in ways that could eventually weaken its regional position?
So that is the question for the Turks,
Hmm.
that what what are their imperatives and what are their constraints and limitations? Clearly, they have to sort out economic problems at home.
Hmm.
There is a pending political transition,
Hmm.
given how long President Erdogan has been in power, and the fact that, the outcome of the recent municipal elections was not favorable. On the contrary, the ruling Justice and Development Party, the AKP, lost a lot of ground to the opposition. They also have the Kurdish problem that, as you notice, they're trying to address on the home front while
Hmm.
they deal with a Syria that is no longer ruled by the Assad regime. And it's the Turks who are trying to establish a new regime that is putting them in confrontation with Iran, putting them in confrontation, potential confrontation, in the future with Israel. And there are challenges. I mean, and if the United States and Russia reach an accommodation, let's say they don't reach an accommodation, let's say there's just an end to war in Ukraine. Let's just take the minimalist outcome and sort of assume that for argument purposes. Even then, that brings respite to Russia. Russia can stem its hemorrhaging, its geopolitical hemorrhaging, as well as economic hemorrhaging. And then that forces Turkey to reshape its position. The future of Europe is at stake. And
mm,
Poland is trying to emerge in its part of Europe, Eastern Europe,
mm,
which from the Baltics all the way down to the Mediterranean Black Sea, which means that the Turks and the Poles will have to somehow work together or not, at least for Eastern Europe. What will Eastern Europe look like? Western Europe has its own realities, but these areas that are uh, west of the Black Sea, the countries Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, the Balkans, these are areas that are going to, are of interest, strategic interest to the Poles and the Turks. So I think that Turkey has its work cut out for itself. Turkey aspires to have sort of a trans-Caspian influence, sphere of influence with Central Asia, the broader Turkic world. And that is also, will be in question. Turkey's footprint, while not as nowhere near as what the Chinese have been able to do, but the Turks have benefited. Azerbaijan and the South Caucasus and the conflict with Armenia, the outcome of that between the war in 2020 and last year, or over a year ago, actually, uh, essentially shows that the Turks benefited. The Turks are finally uh, sort of ascendant against Iran after being checkmated for decades or being blocked strategically by the Iranians, both in the Middle East and the South Caucasus. So the world for around Turkey, its 360 degrees environment is shifting. And so it will have to make amends, and again, it remains to be seen what they can achieve. They have imperatives, but constraints shape what you can accomplish from
mm.
your menu of imperatives and what is the first order of business. So a lot of moving parts. So Turkey will be an interesting place to watch as this, the global order shifts. Turkey is situated in a place that gives it access to many parts, many strategic parts of the world.
And yeah, and I'm glad that you brought China to discussion, because I didn't talk about it because most of the focus of your articles has been on Russia and the middle powers. But I was reading another article by Rajesh Rajagopalan, the geopolitical expert from India. Uh, his article appeared in The Print. He warns that US disengagement would create an opportunity for China to expand its global influence, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately there's a lot of overestimation of Chinese actual abilities.
Mhm,
Um, if you look at, so we don't know what the Trump administration will do. There's not been much information as to
mm,
what his China policy is going to be. There's tariffs, and then there's, two step forwards, one step backwards. They're still sort of figuring it out.
mm,
But if you look at what happened under the Biden administration, between the time, and I believe it was the summer of 2023, when then Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen went to China. And then since then, you've had a slew of meetings between senior US and Chinese military and political and economic affairs officials in Beijing, in America, and in third place, in third party venues as well. Why is China interested? What is China's imperative right now? China's economy has taken, is on a downturn, a serious one.
mm,
And China is undergoing political change as well. So the
mm,
bureaucratized, institutionalized authoritarian system in which the Chinese Communist Party was the center of gravity has given way to a very personalized leadership in
mm,
the form of President Xi Jinping, who now
mm,
has an unprecedented third term. So and if you look at the way he's purging his military, he's purging, the party and the leadership. And it continues. Just recently, before the big annual meetings that were supposed to take place this past week, he purged people from the military who had a
mm,
presence in the Chinese legislature. So this thing is ongoing. It is not something that has ended. And now, if you look at how the people that Xi is purging,
mm,
most of them are those whom he brought because he purged others. So this is a second round of purge going on. So either these people aren't working for him or he's struggling. I mean, if you look at the economy, if you look at the market, the housing market crisis, if you look at unemployment, if you look at the flight of capital to other destinations, that's the problem of the Chinese. The Chinese need three things from the United States. They need the US to cease this discouragement of investments in China. They need the easing of trade restrictions, and they need lifting or respite of restrictions on technology transfer. So these are the three things. I mean, you noticed what Xi has done is he's gone back to the private sector after a very
mm,
long time. And why is he doing that? This is something that, this level of engagement we haven't seen between the Chinese government and its private sector. And there's a problem there. If you allow the private sector to behave the way it does normally under a capitalist economy, then it creates a problem for the political imperatives of the party.
mm,
So the fact that the Chinese leadership is willing to allow the private sector of the country
mm,
space to operate shows how dire the economic circumstances are, that they're willing to risk, uh, if you will, their own control because they're juggling two different imperatives. They need to
mm,
get the economy back to where it was or close enough, and at the same time maintain the power of the CCP. Those two
mm,
things are now in tension with one another.
mm,
And so China is not the kind of player. I mean, recently, the Tasman Sea live fire exercises between New Zealand and Australia on the part of a few Chinese ships made the headlines. But
mm,
even the Chinese know what they're doing. They're not demonstrating their ability to project military power. They're
mm,
basically saying they are worried of what is to come between Russia and the United States. This diplomacy that's going on is very unsettling for them. And the reason for that is they did the same thing with Moscow in the 70s when they were negotiating with the United States. So their fear is that now it's their turn to be isolated because they are the dominant, between Russia and China, they are now the larger partner, if you will. And
yeah,
so they are worried about how these things are going and they have internal problems that analysts don't factor in. And
mm,
we tend to sort of overreach or engage in worst case scenarios by not really looking at, can China really go to war if we are to read these signals? What is China trying to say? That we're going to come attack Australia and
mm,
New Zealand? They know that, the United States has far more firepower that they could sink its fleet within hours. They are very well aware of that. That's not
mm,
what they're achieving. They're gesturing and they are basically trying to gain the American attention and say, let's come to the table. So these
mm,
are gestures, these are not provocative moves. You do not do these kind of things knowing your own vulnerabilities at home. China
mm,
cannot afford a conflict.
mm,
Why? Because it would completely disrupt its economy. That's how
mm,
linked it is with the rest of the world. A war in the Western Pacific over Taiwan or something else will just risks tanking the Chinese economy. It will be devastating for the world as well. But China's situation is not going to get stronger. You engage in military moves if you think you are going to get stronger. Are there miscalculations? Sure, they always are. But the Chinese have shown that they are a very conservative power. They are very careful. They're more interested in making money and expanding their geoeconomic footprint in the world than through military conquest.
Military power, yeah. And but how I see is, I mean, you obviously you are saying that the whatever the world order is emerging, China is at the risk of isolation more than US is. I see it the other way around. For example, China's three major three parts of major parts of the vision of Xi Jinping are global development initiative, global civilizational initiative, and most importantly, global security initiative, GSI. Now, GSI, in my opinion, gels quite well with Europe's collective security paradigm conception. So if and US, the current changes that we are seeing in the US posturing, they suggest, I mean, it suggests that US is not very convinced of the collective security. They're trying to move out of it or distance itself from it. Now, if GSI and Europe's collective security meets up somewhere, then isolation threat is not with China so much that it is with USA.
So I would have to disagree with you on that because these are all statements, GSI, global development, BRI. These are all, things that you do. Look at BRI. The biggest BRI project is Pakistan, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. That's
Mm,
the biggest in terms of dollar value.
mm,
What's happening to that? It's a
mm,
complete failure. There is no return on the investment.
mm,
Uh, so, and then Myanmar was another arm called the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, part
mm,
of the Chinese strategy for the Indian Ocean Basin.
mm,
It's in shambles. Myanmar is falling apart, and Myanmar, and if you look at it from the Chinese point of view, even Central Asia, Tajikistan is fragile
mm,
country is could undergo instability at any moment because its president is aging and
mm,
Russia is not able to help it in the way it has. And it sits right next to China's own problematic part, China, of mainland China, which is Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs live. And they've had a massive problem. So there's Afghanistan. So you have a confluence of factors and then there's the rise of India as well. These things have to be factored in by the Chinese. So the Kool-Aid that they send out, and so there is posturing, there are statements, and there's intent. But what is the
mm,
capability is the question. And uh,
mm,
if as far as GSI is concerned and the European collective security, first of all, America is not sort of saying, I'm not going to be part of collective security. They're saying we're not going to be the ones doing everything or most everything. If it's a
mm,
collective security, then allies need to pony up and they need to, do more. Uh, so that's very different from abdication. So there's no space opening. Assuming there was a space opening, uh, is China in a position to help? China wasn't able to help Russia. Russia needed, who did Russia go out to help for? North Korea,
mm,
Iran.
mm,
So if the Chinese didn't help the Russians, then so
mm,
much for sort of the unlimited, unbounded relationship that they keep talking about.
mm,
And do you think that the Europeans are going to trust the Chinese? If the Europeans are angry at the United States because they're saying, hey, we're all part of the broader West and we're bound together by shared values, do you think they're going to trust the Chinese? And the Chinese relationship with any country, whether it's in Africa or Asia, those
mm,
countries who do business with China know the limits of that relationship. They have no development model that will work for the Europeans, much less the countries in Africa and other parts of Asia, because their
mm,
model is the CCP. It isn't working. So what I'm trying to say is these things are overlooked when we think
mm,
of China, and we just think, oh, if the US is moving out, it creates a space for China. It does, in theory, it does. But the question
mm.
is, can the Chinese take advantage of it? Do they have the tools for it? And especially when you have so many constraints domestically and internationally, I just
mm,
don't see the Chinese being able to fill this vacuum. They haven't
mm,
demonstrated the ability to do that.
mm. Yeah. So last question about your point on the global security transition as a necessary but uncertain process. We don't know what is going to happen, where the old order is fading, but a new one has yet to emerge. But past transitions, such as the post-World War One or the Cold War's aftermath, they have often led to major instability. In your opinion, what safeguards or strategic frameworks are necessary to prevent this shift from spiraling into a more chaotic, conflict-prone era? And does the US have a coherent strategy for managing this kind of transition, or is it just improvising based on short-term, political calculation I asked earlier, but just in a different context?
No, it's a great question. So look, there probably is a very broad strategy that the Trump
Mm,
administration, I'm actually certain that there is a broad strategy. There is a method behind the madness,
mm,
to use that phrase.
mm,
Uh, but the details aren't worked out because they can't be worked out.
mm,
You can't have, this isn't like a production of a movie where there's a script and there's
mm,
choreography and whatnot. This is real life. This is, the human condition. There's absolute uncertainty
mm,
compared to a very controlled environment.
mm,
Or uncertainty has if you will, a large part. It's a large part of the plan because you can only make a plan that's only so good.
mm,
So I think that there is a strategy.
mm,
The details need to be worked out. The
mm,
details may not work. As
mm,
I said, uh, adjusting to a world that has changed and
mm,
coming up with a new paradigm is
mm.
by definition a very messy process.
Yeah.
And it's bound to run into certain problems. There will be conflicts. Now, uh, I think that to answer your question, there are no safeguards, if you will. But what you have to understand that political actors are risk averse. What they
Mm,
don't want is to end up in a worse off position. They do things to better themselves, to improve their political standing, to improve the
mm,
standing of their nations that they represent. And I'm talking about every country. So we have to assume that. The second thing here is, unlike in the past, so when World War II ended, in World War II there was a choice. Actually, there
mm,
wasn't much of a choice if you ask me. How do
mm,
you defeat the Third Reich? Your allies, UK, Great Britain, and
mm,
France, are
mm,
exhausted. There
mm,
is nobody else. Italy is aligned with the Third Reich.
mm,
Nazi Germany is the largest power on the continent. It has, you know, taken over large parts. Basically, France. France was taken over by Germany.
mm,
It invaded the Soviet Union. So you have a choice. You have to make a choice now. You have to make a decision. What was the decision of the time? The decision was to work with Stalin, who wasn't, to put it politely, a nice guy, and his regime
mm.
was not, it was a very brutal regime.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have to make very difficult and painful decisions in order to deal with bigger problems. So you
Mm,
accept the lesser of the evil, if you will.
mm,
That led to a reality where World War II ended, and then somehow seamlessly the world moved into the Cold War with the Soviet Union.
yeah.
The cost of working with the Soviet Union was that Soviet forces would take over much of Eastern Europe. Germany was divided.
Mm,
And so that was a cost. Uh, that reality, and if you look at the world today, there is a, if you will, weakness all around in the international system. We talked about how the Chinese are in a weak position. We've talked about the weakness of the Russians. There's no other actor that can become a spoiler. The United States has its own weaknesses, which are
Mm,
driving this change.
mm,
So I think that if you ask my opinion, I think that the circumstances are relatively favorable for a transition. That doesn't mean the transition will be smooth or it will be possible. I can't answer those questions. I can only tell you comparing conditions on the ground.
mm,
Uh, this world is much different than the world that emerged out of World War II or in the early part of the 20th century. But I think that there is there are more favorable conditions and which can help mitigate some of the risks. A lot of it will depend on how it is handled,
mm,
what becomes of the negotiations. Because it's one thing to say, well, you know, we need to bring an end to forever wars. It's another thing to actually realize them. And
mm,
so I think we just have to wait and see how the Trump administration handles this. And mind you, there's commotion inside the United States. At the same time, he's trying to, uh, restructure the federal government. So that creates peril as well. That adds to the uncertainty, that adds to the risks. Uh, and there are constraints upon the Trump White House. We are less than 2 years away from midterms. And everything is political calculations. So
mm,
if what is being done, if the actions of the Trump administration
mm,
lead to a situation and to outcomes that are not favorable, let's say the economy takes a hit
mm,
with all these tariffs, with all this restructuring that's going on and the shakeup, the markets react negatively, which they are, at least in the last, few weeks they have. But let's say this situation exacerbates and there's food and fuel inflation in this country. Then
mm.
there's not going to be an appetite for public support. Then it's going to cost the president from his own base, his own party will begin to doubt. Does the
But
president know?
why would he worry about that? He doesn't have to, contest another term.
He doesn't,
Mm,
but he
Republican.
wants
Yeah.
it's the Republican Party, and he also wants to leave a legacy. He's at that he's approaching 80, and
Mm,
he's not and then there are health issues. You could be great,
mm,
but this is an age in which things can go wrong, and then they and it's a concern. So I think there are constraints on the president. He's mindful of it. He has his, like every other leader, he has his idiosyncrasies. His idiosyncrasies are a bit different than the rest because he's a
mm,
different type of politician. His
mm,
personality is very different from others, but he has been elected by the people of the United States.
mm,
And so um, we have to wait and see, and we have to
mm,
continue to sort of hold the government accountable, which is
mm,
the job of, the attentive citizenry in any democracy. And so there's a lot of work for everybody out there, and particularly this administration, because it is embarked upon a journey on something that is of very large magnitude, both internally and globally. And so let's see where it goes. This change
mm,
will, exceed beyond the Trump second term. And I
mm.
would say that we're looking at a good decade of transformation.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent line to end on. It brings us to the end of today's discussion. A huge thanks to you, Dr. Kamran Bokhari, for joining us and offering your insights on this evolving global order. As we have explored today, the global order is at a crossroads. Dr. Kamran Bokhari has laid out a compelling argument that the US is actively reshaping its foreign policy, shifting security responsibilities to its allies. While Dr. Bukhari takes a sort of revisionist stance, suggesting that a major restructuring is already underway and that allies must adapt to a new reality where the US is less directly involved. And other experts with a somewhat realistic conservative approach argue that US leadership is essential and cannot essentially relinquish without global consequences. And Dr. Bukhari has addressed that point quite eloquently as well. Which view will prevail depends on whether US allies can effectively step up to fill the security gaps left by Washington's retrenchment, or if the global instability forces the US to re engage. These are the debates that define our world today. And at Unraveled, we remain committed to breaking down these complex issues with depth, nuance, and objective journalism. If you found today's discussion valuable, please support independent journalism by subscribing to New Wave Global. Don't forget to like, share, and comment on this episode to keep the conversation going. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Unraveled with Marvi Sirmed.